Okay. Hey everybody, this is Rem. Again, I'm still a rising junior at Tufts. This is gonna be the 13th episode of Keeping Democracy Alive, a speaker series that I've been um, hosting as an intern at Tufts Hillel. I'm very grateful for all the work that my supervisors have done. And basically the whole point of this speaker series is to highlight various figures in our community who often go unnoticed for the incredible work that they're doing. So this week I'm really excited to introduce my cousin, Sierra Weiss. And Sierra is really, she's an activist in the community of in the studies of disabilities and for people who have disabilities. She's about to graduate from a master's program at Emory. Her master's is in bioethics, and she has a focus on disability ethics. And just generally throughout her life, and she'll tell us more about it, she's been just an advocate. So I thought it would be great to bring her on and to learn from her.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Rem.
That's my shaky introduction because it's been a couple weeks, but take it away. Just introduce yourself.
Okay. So I'm Sierra. As Rem said, I'm his cousin. I am, as Rem said, a disability advocate. I have been involved for many years at this point in the disability community, working with people with disabilities. I got involved through a sleepaway camp I went to, Camp Vermont in New England, which had a really robust inclusion program. And just from there, started getting more and more involved in different opportunities to work with people with disabilities, to get to know people with disabilities. And then in my academics, I just started writing as many papers as I could about the history of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or really anything else related to disability that I could fit into the topics of the classes I was taking. And then when I got to college at Emory, I got really lucky and found out that disability studies was actually a field of studies that existed, and Emory was kind of the perfect place to do it. A lot of the founders of the field are professors there. There are a lot of people who do research in that field, and just kind of kept growing my resume, I guess, to establish myself in the field. And now I'm about to graduate from my master's program and excited to see what comes next. I don't really know yet.
Yeah, it's come a long way. So obviously, like I have a bit more insight than most people, even your friends, I probably have more insight than. So let's kind of start at the beginning. Let's talk about Dance for Empowerment. Can you tell us about what Dance for Empowerment is, like what motivated you to start it, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So Dance for Empowerment is a nonprofit I started when I was in high school. It created dance programs for children with disabilities. It started because, as I mentioned, I got kind of my start in this field when I was in high school, when I was a camper, so I guess a little bit before high school. And then I was inspired to start this program as a fellow in the Diller Teen Fellowship. You're tasked with doing a Tikkun Olam project at the end of your fellowship. And I decided to combine my passion for disability inclusion, and I was also a dancer in high school. So dance seemed like a really great way to kind of merge my interests. I always found dance really therapeutic for myself. And then also found out dance therapy was like a real thing that had been proven useful for people with a variety of different disabilities and different mental disabilities. So I created Dance for Empowerment as my Tikkun Olam project. My first ever program was actually at Camp Vermont, where I first was introduced to people with disabilities. And so we did a dance program at the camp, and then I think we did one or two more the following summers, and then a few other programs throughout the year with children with disabilities, bringing in dance therapists and different volunteers to do these really fun dance programs that the kids loved.
Yeah, and my understanding is like that was a pretty innovative thing, right? Like no one had really thought of doing something along those lines beforehand, or at least like you were kind of introducing something new. Is that correct?
I don't know if I necessarily was introducing something new. There definitely are dance programs for people with disabilities. an idea that I had in developing it that unfortunately never, I soon after went to college and kind of things took a rest with Dance for Empowerment. But my goal was to eventually um, turn it into this bigger program where the dancers, the children who did the dance programs would do performances that would then raise money to further develop and support other arts therapy programs. So arts therapy is a pretty robust tool for people with disabilities and other things that they're going through. But the kind of like the second step of empowering the kids to then be able to support other people through art therapy, that was like the ultimate goal. Unfortunately, we never really got there in the first iteration of the program, but I still kind of maintain Dance for Empowerment in the hopes that sometime in the future I might be able to reestablish it more robustly and kind of further those original goals that I had with it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Like I think like
Thank you.
I think back to when I was younger, and I remember hearing about all this stuff, and we'd get Passover and you'd be talking about it. I just found it super interesting. Just like, I don't know, I told this to you before we like started recording. I think like often people don't really think too much about the community of people with disabilities, and the fact that you're already thinking about that like so early on in your life, whether it was because of Vermont or whatever the influence was is irrelevant. Like, is pretty incredible. And so
Yeah,
the
and it was exactly, sorry, if I could just add
yeah,
one
go
more
ahead.
thing.
Yeah,
It's exactly kind of what you said of a lot of people are not aware, and that's kind of what
yeah,
made me so keenly aware because at camp, it was like people with disabilities were around. I, did different activities with them. They were in the dining hall with us. And
yeah.
then when I got back home to like my school life, my non-camp life, I was like, where are all these people with
Yeah,
disabilities? It just kind of I realized that there was this whole group that was just not a part of my day-to-day life, and I wanted to understand why that was and try to change it because at camp it became so clear the importance of bringing people with and without disabilities together to have better integrated places in society. And so yeah, exactly what you said is what
yeah,
I realized.
yeah. And I think that exposure and the opportunity to meet people with disabilities is there, and like teenagers will get that. But the thing that often doesn't occur is like a genuine, um, I don't want to say like interest, because that kind of makes them sound like possessions in a way, but like a genuine
Like a connection, friendship.
connection and like just empathy for them and like compassion, right? And like as at such a young age you already had that and you wanted to give back, and it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to be with them for a day and then forget about them and make them feel good for a day. It's like you really wanted to develop like a relationship. Excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add also that something that really struck me, and I'm sure there are a lot of other people who've had this experience
Yeah,
because I didn't have interactions prior to camp with people with disabilities. The first time I was introduced to a camper with disabilities, and this is a story I've written a lot about, but I've not talked about it a lot. I was in a camp activity and suddenly I felt someone jumping on my shoulders. And I turned around and there was this young man with Down syndrome who was smiling at me and waving at me. And I was really scared. And I just kind of stood there until his counselor came to collect him and was just like, oh, he just wanted to say hi. He really wanted to participate in this activity. And I just couldn't stop thinking about that for the rest of the night. How kind of embarrassed I was. That was my interaction to someone who just wanted to say hi and be my friend and participate in an activity that I was doing. And that for me really like instigated the spark of like, why is that my reaction? And how can I change that for myself and also for other people? Because it's a fellow human who just clearly wanted to make a friend, and
yeah,
that's what we're all trying to do. And so I think that I hope that when other people have those sorts of reactions, like meeting someone who's new and different, there's always kind of like a fear to it, but to kind of move beyond that and see everyone else as another person who just wants the same things that we do.
yeah. So let's talk more about your research, because like I talked to you about earlier, like I've talked to Eric Jacobson,
Hmm.
who you actually worked with, and we'll get to
Yeah,
that.
he's great.
Yeah, he's amazing. Just a really big voice and figure, and I love it. But I would say the difference between what you kind of bring to the table and what he brings to the table, and this is not a shot at him at all, they're both very important, is I feel like you've done a lot of really awesome like academic research, um, which can be applicable in so many ways and can be
Hmm.
introduced to society in so many ways, whereas his is more hands-on work and like figuring out policy. So let's
Hmm.
start talking about that academic research you've done.
Sure.
And I know you've done a lot, so we'll start like kind of where I think the beginning is. And so let's talk about your research paper that you had in college, the one about interabled relationships. I know it might be a long time ago, so you might need a second to refresh. But when I was reading about the article you sent me, um, yeah, it's kind of exactly like we just talked about. Like it's foreign, right? It's like something I'm not used to. Like let alone having a friendly like encounter with a person or yeah, a person with a disability, um, having a full on relationship and living a life that is inclusive is completely different. Um,
Hmm.
so I'd like for you, if you can, if you remember all the research you did, to talk about that, the importance of learning about interabled relationships, some of your takeaways from that, etc.
Sure. So that was a really fun paper to write, and it was in collaboration with two of my classmates at the time. But our goal was to kind of showcase kind of what I was just saying to you before, but like breaking down those barriers of when you first meet someone who is different than you, someone who you might even have stereotyped of when you meet someone who is of that stereotype that you've been kind of told or heard all your life. It shatters all those preconceived notions and just allows you to have a relationship like you do with any other person. So what we did in that project is that we interviewed three different what we called interabled relationships, which was with a person with a disability and a person without a disability, and in three different contexts. So there were two professors who are colleagues and friends. There was a couple who were engaged at the time. I believe now that they're married, and then a mother and a daughter, and how the disability interacts with that relationship, and what was kind of the effect of that disability becoming part of the relationship, which was true of the mother daughter and then the couple who they both the mother and then the woman in the relationship both became disabled um, at um, at some point during the relationship. Whereas with the two professors, one of the professors, Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's one of my mentors, she was born with a disability. And we explored how being in such a close relationship with someone who has a disability changes the way you both view that person, and talking about how like an outsider views a person with disability versus someone who's in a relationship of any nature with a person with disabilities, how you don't really see the disability as an obstacle or something you think about. It's just kind of there, and it's part of the person and part of, you know, how they operate in the world. And kind of how breaking down those barriers and having relationships with people with disabilities and kind of in any context or to any extent changes the way you view other people with disabilities as well, and is a really important step in inclusion.
Yeah, yeah. I also thought it was like a really interesting um, aspect to include a relationship that um, I don't want to use the word include, but it just works. That included a person that developed a disability later on in life.
Hmm.
Um, at least for me, it's something that like when I think about people with disabilities, I think um, initially I think that my thoughts first go to like Down syndrome,
Hmm.
autism, um, maybe someone who has physical disabilities, um, and rarely I'm thinking about just general um, just problems that might occur in your life that could result in you having a disability. Um, so yeah, I found that really interesting because it made it a lot more relevant to me. Right, I come from a
Hmm.
family that doesn't have obviously, you know, my family, but for other people, like no one really has any disabilities.
Right.
But as we saw with our great uncle, things can happen later on, and you have to learn how to adapt to a life um, with those things. And yeah, it just, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think that it's really important um, to humanize those people, and,
Hmm.
and not put like a stigma around a problem that they might be having, but rather to
Right.
show them compassion.
Right. And interestingly, the article was actually, it was published in a journal of rehabilitation, because it was a course taught by a few professors in the rehabilitation school at Emory. And it was it was really interesting because a lot of rehabilitation is about, rehabilitating the body to come to be back at, its normal baseline.
Mhm.
But what I think that this article kind of pushed for was to also recognize that there are other social factors that can help someone either return to normal or, create a new normal, and that's also okay. And that definitely can change relationships if a disability comes later in life. But there are ways to work with that and, build new foundations, and a new baseline for those relationships.
Yeah, and just it just also really shows the importance that love has in someone's health, right?
Mhm.
Like especially as I was talking about with someone who might develop a disability later on in life, that could be really tough, right? Um, like it
Yeah, it's a change.
yeah,
Changes are really challenging, no
exactly.
matter what they are.
Yeah, and you don't, and the worst thing possible would be for someone to dismiss you, especially loved people, like
Mhm.
loved ones, excuse me. Yes, and I just wanted to read this one quote that I thought was amazing from what you wrote, and it says one of the greatest takeaways was the recognition that both the person with the disability and the person without played equally important roles in developing and maintaining the relationship. One was never necessarily weaker or inferior to the other. Instead, each individual complemented the other so as to fill in any gaps in knowledge and ability. That's so beautiful, right? Like like that's something I think that that's how every relationship should be, regardless of whether or not there's a disability. But the fact that they found that within a relationship, in lieu of something that could be viewed as tragic,
Mhm.
is kind of amazing, in my opinion. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, and just yeah, I guess we can move on. But there's one other thing that you talked about in that um, research that I found interesting. It was talking about just um, I think this was your introduction, and you could correct me if I'm wrong too. Like starting to think about um, the ways in which as a society we treat people with disabilities. So you started thinking about like therapy and how therapists typically um, diagnose and provide
Mhm.
treatment for people with disabilities. And you say that you say that you're basically showing that oftentimes people with disabilities are given treatments that really aren't in line with what their goals are. You're talking about how therapists or doctors or whomever is providing treatment is kind of just like, okay, this is what's best for you, rather than talking to the couple or the family or the person themselves and figuring out what life, what an ideal life and a happy
Mhm.
life would look like for them. Um, so yeah, I don't know if you remember any of your takeaways from that or any of the reasons why that was such a valuable piece to include, but I'd love for you to talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I think what you're touching on is something it's really important to a lot of the writing and research I do, which is there are these different models of disabilities that are discussed in academia. The first is called the medical model of disability, which is kind of the first thing you're saying, how the medical world views disability, which is typically as something that's a medical problem, something that needs to be fixed or cured. And what has been promoted more recently, especially by disability scholarship, and advocates is what's called the social model of disability, which is views disability rather than a problem or a medical issue of the person, but as an issue of society, in that the way society is constructed is in itself disabling. So, for example, if someone uses a wheelchair and the only option to get into a building is stairs, is it them that has a disability, or is it the building that is making them disabled by not providing them equal access into the building?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's really important. And obviously, with certain disabilities, there are medical aspects of it, but that doesn't mean that any person with a disability or any other, medical situation should be defined by those medical diagnoses or symptoms. There's a social aspect of everyone's life, and that's really important to recognize.
Yeah, and just to clarify for myself, is this, when we're talking about like the medical approach to this, when we say that, are we talking about like American medicine? Are we talking about like Western medicine? And if so, are there countries that are kind of, or societies or cities or communities, I don't even know how far on we are as a world in this, but is there anyone that's a leader in pushing for a more inclusive way of life, I guess?
So I can't really answer that because
Yeah,
most
it's
of my
fine.
research focuses on US medicine. But what I will say is something that I think is really interesting to think about is I think a lot of the reason people are sometimes uncomfortable with disability is because a big misconception or preconceived notion about disability is that disability causes dependence. And I think American society puts a lot of emphasis on independence. I mean, I feel like, your whole childhood, you're dreaming and thinking about, when are you going to grow up and go to college or grow up and become
Yeah,
independent? And which then puts people with certain disabilities who might not be fully able to be independent from their caregivers or, medical professionals. There's this automatic, oh, well, they're dependent on other people. So, they can't be adults, they can't take care of themselves, which is not true. I mean, I know so many very, very impressive, accomplished people with disabilities, and while they might, have some assistance from caretakers or other people in their lives, they're incredibly independent. And I do think that in other societies, especially like in Europe, that is much less an emphasis. I mean, a lot of people, even once they have their own families, will still live in their parents' homes and things of that nature. So this whole like push towards, when am I moving out of my parents' house, it is less of a complication. But I mean, that's just really one small example.
yeah. So let's move on to your next bit of research that you did, because you did so much and you're still doing more. Um, your undergrad thesis.
Mhm.
And my understanding, and you're going to tell us more about it, is it was pretty much talking about or highlighting the reality around having a kid who might have a disability. And you were looking into how being told, like what I don't know how to frame it, but you were looking into basically what happens when a mother or a couple is told that their kid might have a disability prior
Mhm.
to giving birth to their kid, right?
Right.
And how they approach it from then on, and whether or not they decide to terminate the pregnancy or not. So take it
Exactly.
away
So,
and explain more.
sure. So, and again, this was, a few years back
Yeah,
now.
of course.
So, I'll give the best synopsis I can. But essentially, I did research on, I focus specifically on Down syndrome just because it is kind of like the most widely available prenatal disability screening that's available. And Down syndrome, as you said earlier in this conversation, most people are very familiar with Down syndrome as a disability. So I did research and collected through a TV show called Born This Way, a few parent memoirs, and then conversations with a doctor at the Down syndrome clinic at Mass General Hospital, Brian Scott Coe, who is wonderful, a discussion about prenatal diagnoses of Down syndrome and how their delivery might affect parents' decisions whether to terminate or continue the pregnancy, and looked a lot at over the years. So the parents who talked about their diagnoses in the show Born This Way, their kids were, in their mid to late 20s. So we're talking about conversations with doctors that went back kind of like 20 or so years. And then the memoirs were all like 5 to 10 years old. And then Dr. Scott provided kind of more current conversations, as well as he works in a clinic that specifically focuses on Down syndrome, and just kind of explored those conversations and their variants. And if I recall correctly, it wasn't so much conclusive, these are bad ways to give a diagnosis and these are good ways, and the bad ways cause terminations of Down syndrome, but more a discussion around the different ways these diagnoses are delivered, how they might affect parents' perceptions of Down syndrome. So if the parent, like I said before, if the doctor provides, this is Down syndrome and these are all the medical problems that the child might have, versus, something that's really awesome that's happening in Massachusetts right now. There's legislation called the Down Syndrome Education Act, which requires that along with the diagnosis of Down syndrome, there's a certain amount of resources that are provided to parents, which include options to talk to other parents who have, and people who actually have Down syndrome. So they themselves can express their experience and their lived, what their life looks like with Down syndrome. And there is definitely a variance. There's a spectrum of what the outcomes could be, but the social aspect, as I said earlier, is really important. And of course, there are medical aspects to consider, but it's important that a diagnosis of Down syndrome is not just a list of medical problems that could happen. It's also this kind of inclusive, unbiased description of what life will actually look like.
Yeah. How has Massachusetts responded to, like, have things changed as a result of this new program that they introduced, or?
I wouldn't know how to answer that exactly. Just I haven't looked at like
Yeah,
statistics about these things, but I would say and this is kind of like ties into my current thesis as well, and like some more updated research I've been doing on this. I do think that there's more confidence, I think, that when a parent is provided more material, more just holistic material about what a diagnosis of a disability will look like, rather than this kind of like antiquated medical description of the disability. There's more confidence that the decision that they're then making is an educated decision, an autonomous decision by the parents, and not one that's kind of pushed by medical bias against disability.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is like very extreme, but I hate to like bring up the whole idea of eugenics, but I know that that's kind of been like, and actually like you can talk about it, like eugenics has actually been a part of your research. So how does this idea of eugenics and using certain ways to describe people who might have a disability, how do those two things relate to one another?
Yeah, I mean,
there is definitely some sort of relation, right? And
there is a relation, and I think that, and I'm glad you said it kind of as bluntly as you did, because it is kind of uncomfortable and
very uncomfortable,
a little scary to say, like, this 100%. There might be some relation with this in eugenics. And if it's okay with you, I'll back up a little bit to explain how I kind of got to eugenics.
It's your interview, it's not me. It's all about you.
So, so the way I kind of got into eugenics and Holocaust research in relation to my disability research, which when it was first kind of proposed to me felt like a stretch. My professor, Rosemary Garland Thompson, who I mentioned previously, came to me after I did a presentation in one of her classes about our grandfather, who is a Holocaust survivor. And she, obviously was very familiar with my disability studies and research, but she didn't know I also had a very deep connection to the Holocaust. And so she kind of informed me and guided me in some research about one of the original stages of the Holocaust, which was the T4 program, which basically did experiments on euthanizing people with disabilities because they were already separated from society in hospitals or in institutions, and so there was really easy access to them. And this was a part of the Holocaust I really was unfamiliar with. I mean, I think I kind of recall in high school in my Holocaust course, like a mention of the T4 program, but it didn't really resonate with me at the time. And so we did a semester of research together. I also, I got a grant from Emory and I went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC and did research there, and just familiarized myself with the eugenic practices of the Nazis and how that related to people with disabilities. And in doing that, I realized that there are relations to what so what I was talking about before with diagnoses, negative terminology and diagnoses of disabilities is often referred to as selective abortion. So choosing to abort a fetus because of a disability. And in some of the language, there are reflections of some of the language that was used to describe people with disabilities, and even later, like the Jews. I mean, you read my articles more recently, but there was a lot of language that's reflective, and I think that something that we need to be careful about in discussing disability in the context of abortion and also the end of life is just to make sure we're not setting up a situation in which we're choosing to remove people with specific disabilities from our society, because again, there is a lot of reference there to the Holocaust and those practices. And I think now more than ever, we're very familiar with the benefit of the diversity and the importance of having people with disabilities in our society. And I don't think it's something most of us want to remove, but it's just some of it's still reflected in the language.
Yeah, it's tough. That's a lot. I think Eric and I talked about, like, not only is it true that people with disabilities are capable of living independent, as you said, are capable of working and doing things just as well as us, as in able-bodied people. But on top of that, and this relates to what you're saying, on top of that, I think that and this is definitely a generalization, so tell me if I'm going a little too far, but I feel like they can even provide like a whole new perspective on things that we don't get, right? Like I know that I like they're human beings, right? And they're very, like, I don't like how I'm saying people with disabilities are human beings. They are creative. They think uniquely like every other human being. They love like every other human being.
Mm-hmm.
They're human beings. So yeah, it's frightening that it was frightening for me, at least, to read your piece and learn that American doctors were so kind of lax in the way that they would talk about babies that might have a disability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and I think something
yeah,
important that you're getting at is
yeah,
the importance of giving people with disabilities the voice and the platform and the
yeah,
opportunity to define their own experiences. I mean,
yeah,
like something we mentioned before we started recording of like the terminology of person with a disability, which is like the PC terminology, which is person first language, versus saying like a disabled person. And that, I mean, the relevance of that is that we are people first. That's true of everyone. And then we get to choose what identities we want to define ourselves by.
Yeah.
And um, with certain disabilities, there are groups who do choose to do identity first language. It's pretty common of the capital D deaf community, which is the deaf like culture. Many people who are deaf prefer to say, you know, I'm a deaf person versus a person who is deaf. So it's specific, but it's also like there's relevance in asking people, like, how do you identify? How does your disability play into your life? And just giving people the space to define their own experiences,
Yeah.
which is, it's complicated for me to say as a non-disabled person. And I know that this is something I'll kind of face in my career as being a non-disabled person who identifies as a disability advocate and who's in this the role that I've kind of placed myself in. But I do think that there's so much importance in kind of turning the conversation back to the people who we're talking about, of giving them the chance to define themselves and their own experience.
Right. Right. I honestly want to continue talking about your research because there's one other aspect that we haven't touched on and we're running out of time. So I quickly want to just say to anyone who's listening that beyond all the research that Sierra has done, she also, as I mentioned earlier, worked with Eric Jacobson on the Georgia Council on Developmental Disability. She was a participant or a worker in the Ruderman Family Foundation. She was a practicum student for the Marcus Autism Center. And there was another family foundation that you worked for as well that also ended in man, but I'm forgetting at the moment.
Schusterman, but
as well.
they were not disability related.
Oh, okay. Okay. My apologies.
That's okay.
But yeah, I just wanted to bring light to all the, like, beyond the research, um, you actually like have been seeking ways to put it into practice, right? Which is incredible. But to go back to your research, because that's part of the reason why I had you on. I think the research you've been doing is incredible. I wanted to talk to you about, and this plays off perfectly about what you were just talking um, about about allowing people with disabilities to self-define.
Mm-hmm.
The use of um, titles that we've had in society, specifically the word retard, um, and yeah, just can you talk more about the research you've done around that,
Mm-hmm.
and why it's so important for us to always be aware of the way that we're talking about not only people with disabilities, but just generally other people. Yeah.
Everyone, yeah. Sure. So my graduate research has been focusing on creating better disability cultural competency in medical education. And I came to this because one of my friends is in med school and started kind of the year between I graduated from Emory undergrad and started my graduate degree, and was going through all these different kind of cultural competency courses for patients, how to, be respectful and understanding of patients who have different gender identities, different ethnicities, race, all these different aspects of the patient experience that might play into their relationship with their medical provider or their experience of illness, all these different things. And so I was like, oh, like, that's awesome. Like, who's giving the disability lecture? And they're like, oh, there isn't one. And I was shocked. And I kind of started surveying my other friends in medical school and found that this was pretty common, that there wasn't a lot of education around patients with disabilities. And what I found from my undergrad research is that there is actually a pretty robust at this point development in education around for genetic counselors. So for those who are giving the diagnoses, there has been in recent years a growth in that education. So they are more sensitive, specifically for Down syndrome, but also expanding to other disability diagnoses that happen prenatally. But it's not something that's happening across the board in medicine, which I understand why the urgency is on those prenatal diagnoses, but people with disabilities make up, I believe, around 20% of the US population, which means pretty much every medical provider is going to interact with at least one, if not more, patients with disabilities. And it's important for them to understand the most appropriate way to talk to their patients, to first of all to talk to them, not
Yeah.
to their parents, unless like it's specified that that's the preferred method of communication, and to give patients with disabilities autonomy in their medical care, and to address them respectfully as well. And so kind of it started for me in a very in-depth history of the word retard, and to see how that word transitioned from, it was originally medical terminology that was accepted widely as the appropriate word to use to talk about people who had certain developmental disabilities. And then it kind of was, it had this shift in popular culture being used as a pejorative, which really changed the way that word was seen. It quickly became very offensive, and so there was a really big push to remove it, not just from social spaces, but also from medical terminology, legislature as well. Um, and I think it's just a really good case study of the importance of words. The words we use come with a lot of historical baggage, and in certain kind of vulnerable situations, that can really define someone's decision. And I could give, this is a non-medical example, but just kind of on the importance of words. I went to a webinar recently that was on, it was on vulnerable populations, which included, I think it was the homeless, refugees, and people with disabilities. And after listening to the lecture, and the person who spoke about disability was a friend and colleague, I called him up and I said, I'm just curious to hear what you think about disability being categorized in this category of vulnerable, because I think that while it's definitely, it's vulnerable is not an offensive word, but I think that there's a certain kind of negative connotation, or like, we pity the vulnerable, or we need to take care of the vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I was like, I'm not sure that that's the appropriate category for people with disabilities. And so after talking in the webinar, something that's going to happen again for another group, I think that they're going to try to make the change to marginalized groups, because there is, and it's one word. It's so small,
But yeah,
but I think it makes a really big difference in how people go into the conversation, perceive the conversation, and how they leave it thinking about the groups that were discussed.
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to be described by someone else as being vulnerable. Like that's kind of, especially if I'm like expected to then talk in a conversation like everyone's thinking of me as someone who's vulnerable. That's kind of I don't know. I agree. Offensive isn't like necessarily the right word, but
Because
yeah,
there are certainly groups that
it's
are vulnerable, and there's vulnerability and disability in certain contexts, but I think to associate that so significant in that place, it didn't seem appropriate. And I think it's like, it's little things like that where it's just, we can change one word that we
yeah,
use and it makes all the difference.
yeah. It's just assuming, it's just assuming of people with disabilities, which is unfair. Um,
Hmm.
and my understanding is you're working on at least like your goal is to put together kind of a um, I don't know if guide is the right word, but sort of a curriculum or a guide or like a training book manual
Hmm.
type agenda thingy
Yeah, so I've created kind of a pamphlet sort of.
yeah.
You're right. I don't have like the best. It's like it's an educational manual
Yeah,
that I've created.
yeah,
It's based off the chapters of my thesis, and my goal with it. So for this first iteration, it's just kind of an appendix to my thesis. Like my entire thesis, I would say, is a justification for the importance of that manual's use. And then my goal in the future is to develop it in different ways. I think it can turn into a lecture to medical students,
Yeah.
or it can be like expanded into a full curriculum. I kind of wanted to leave the possibilities open, because I think that I want it to be accessible to different schools that might be interested in using it, and to be able to shape the content of it to what makes sense for the school. Because at this point, like, any way we could get this sort of education and material into the education system, that's the first step. And so
Yeah.
whatever way we can make that happen, I want to have, the system ready to support that.
Yeah. I mean, just the work you've done is amazing, and you're only 25, and so
I'm 23. Come
you're
on, don't add
23.
years to me.
I always thought you were only a year younger than Zane,
I am. I turn 24 next month.
but Zane's 26.
Oh, well then I guess I'm 2 years younger.
Yeah, what? You see, you also thought you were a year younger than Zane. Um, Zane's my brother. Um, okay, well, either way, more impressive. You're 23 going on 24, and you're like so far ahead of the game in the studies of disabilities, and you're already thinking of ways that we can improve on that, which is incredible. I wanted to ask
Thank you.
two questions to kind of close.
Sure.
Um, the first is just about going back to like curriculum, right? Going back to education. Um, do you think it's important? I know that for me as a um, as a student in a liberal arts school, um, there's a push. There's not a requirement to take a class on philosophy. There's a push, not a requirement to take a class on ethics. How important do you really think it is for students to actually be exposed to classes on ethics, on on yeah, I'd say ethics is really like the main thing, but it seems to me that it's not that people are necessarily like necessarily evil, necessarily bad, necessarily have bad intentions per se, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that just as a society we're not well educated. Like you said it yourself, there's plenty of doctors who are going to med school for the right purpose, but they're not getting the right education. So do you think that there needs to be a change in our like general education, let alone med school, but general education, and more of a push for ethics and inclusion classes, I guess you could call them?
So yeah, I think that both, and maybe even separately, are really important. I mean, the really useful thing about ethics is that, I mean, sometimes it's about decisions between um, good and bad, but oftentimes it's decisions between two good options, and it's kind of getting through the details of which is the better or more ethical of the two right options.
Yeah.
And I would say that that's been so fundamental to the way I think, and that education has been so important also to just to making good arguments, and not just arguing for argument's sake, but being able to understand the other side, and understand that it's not always an argument about what's right and what's wrong. It's about two people who have different views, but they're both right in their own respects. And how do you argue effectively in those situations, or how do you best come to an agreement or a compromise? So I do think that ethics is definitely really important and useful, and applicable to a lot of different aspects of our life. And then in terms of inclusivity, and cultural competency, I do think it's really important. And I think that, I mean, it's something we're seeing right now coming out of um, the movement of, the issues we've seen recently around race. I mean, they're not recent issues, they've been issues for a very long time, but we're seeing a movement, especially in the liberal arts schools, to include African American history in the core competencies that students have to take. And I do think that there's an opportunity for that to include different forms of discrimination and hate that have been experienced by minority groups in our country.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm glad that you gave your 2 cents on that. I think that, yeah, I just hope that we're ready and prepared to make the change that is needed to be made in this country. So my closing question that I ask everyone, which is kind of hard to adapt for this interview since everything that we talked about was research, but I ask I ask the interviewees, um, how can people get involved? What can the person who's listening do to help you and help, yeah, I guess just help you do what you're doing, help make the lives in this case of people with disabilities better. How can what should, I guess the best thing to say is, what should someone's takeaway be from this conversation?
I think that, I mean, that's a great question. I think that to be more open-minded and respectful of people with disabilities. I mean, the easiest way to go about it is just to avoid it. And I think that we need to take what might feel like the more challenging route, but to be accepting, to not to talk to people with disabilities, to understand their experiences, to ask how they prefer to be referred to. I think that's really important, and just like educate yourself about the language and the history is so important, because I think, and this is something I think is really true of the anti-race work and anti-Semitism. These are not issues that should fall on the shoulders of the people experiencing discrimination. Of course, their voices absolutely need to be heard, and they are part of the movement. But we all have a responsibility towards each other to stand up for what's right, stand up for inclusion and acceptance. And that's true of people with disabilities as well. I think that, that's why I feel it's important that me, as someone who's not personally experienced a disability, and I don't have any family members or anyone close in my life who has a disability, which is pretty unusual in disability advocacy. And I think that there's so much value in the first person experience, and I think that is necessary to any civil rights movement. But we also need the voices of everyone else in order to seek justice and inclusion. um, so I don't know if that exactly
Not,
answers your question. And I'll just say, if you're looking for preliminary reading to do on this, Harriet McBride Johnson is incredible. Rosemary Garland Thompson. Those would be my first two recommendations of people to look up and to read their work to become better acquainted with this.
we can put not only links to the research that you've done, but also links to various readings in the comments of this video posting.
Absolutely,
Um,
that would be great.
I think that's it. Thank you so much. Um, I know that we see each other regularly, but I'd say that this was a conversation that was long overdue. I think that I'm very glad, first of all, that I got you on here to talk about it, and it wasn't just a conversation we had off camera, so other people can hear it too. But yeah, I'm just very impressed with my cousin and all the work that you've done, Sierra. So thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
on and being able and available to talk. Um, and yeah, that
Of
was
course.
episode 13. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.